Let's go to Australia now, where throughout the pandemic, the country's had some of the strictest border measures in the world. And a new law, which takes effect next week, is set to tighten things up even further. Australians who ordinarily live overseas will now have to apply for an exemption to leave their home country, meaning that some citizens could get trapped in Australia if they come back to visit. Well, let's speak to Professor Kim Rubenstein, an expert in Australian citizenship law. She joins us now from the Australian capital, Canberra. Professor Rubenstein, thank you very much for being with us. Just talk us through this new law. What is it?
So it starts from a base where the government introduced early on in the Biosecurity Act a restriction on all Australian citizens, except for those who permanently lived outside of the country, from leaving the country. So that's quite a dramatic step in a Western liberal democracy to say you're not allowed to leave unless you get an exemption. But what had been in place and is in place until next week is if you ordinarily lived outside of the country, then you wouldn't need to apply for that exemption. This change will effectively mean that no matter where you live in the world, once you're in Australia, you are formally trapped and you need an exemption to leave.
What are the legal mechanics for this law being enforced? Is this emergency legislation or has it passed through Parliament?
So the actual framework, the overall framework is the Biosecurity Act, but it gives the Health Minister power to make determinations in order to facilitate the health and wellbeing of the country. But what is interesting, Rich, is within that act, it does actually link back to some basic human rights principles, and that is that those determinations must be appropriate and adapted, and the least restrictive measure available for the circumstances. So I think there are really serious questions, even before this change occurred, just for the starting point of restricting people who are here from leaving without an exemption, as to whether that is in fact the least restrictive measure. Because remember, people are leaving the country, so it's not as if the virus is here with us, they're actually departing. So I think there are really clear questions as to whether this actually even fits properly within the law itself, let alone some broader constitutional questions that I'm happy to discuss with you.
And what are the grounds for exemptions that might mean someone can leave?
So these are just policy guidelines to decision makers, and compassionate grounds are part of them, and also work needs and so forth. But again, these are discretionary. They're not clear. They're not set out in the legislation itself. So it does make people vulnerable to a scenario where a decision maker will say no, and then a person who is in that situation needs to consider legal challenges, which become costly. So it does actually make everyone vulnerable to the decision making of government without clarity.
Okay, interesting stuff. Professor Kim Rubenstein joining us from Canberra. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.